My name is Zuhdi Jasser. I'd like to welcome all of you. We're going to try to start on time. So I know there's some people trying to get in. It's a little tight in these rooms, so thank you for joining us. Why don't we go ahead and get started? As I said, my name is Zuhdi Jasser. I'm a senior fellow with the American Conservative Union, and the organization that I run is a nonprofit, the American Islamic Forum for Democracy. A little bit about myself. I formed the American Islamic Forum with 9 other Muslim families in 2003. My family is from Syria. They escaped in the mid-'60s and grew up in a small town in Wisconsin, was on a Navy scholarship through medical school, then have been in private practice in internal medicine since 1999 in Phoenix. After 9/11, we formed the American Islamic Forum because we realized that the problem wasn't just terrorism, which is a tactic, but rather the ideology of political Islam or the Islamic State. Ever since ISIS was formed, people realized why our mission statement was about the separation of mosque and state, which we formed back in 2003. And I'll get into a little bit more of that. I'm proud to be joined by Raquel Saraswati. She works closely with me at the American Islamic Forum. She's an American Muslim activist and writer whose primary area of focus is rights of women and girls in the Muslim world and Islamic communities in the West. She's a vocal, well-known advocate for religious reform, freedom of speech, equal rights for women and girls. She works to eradicate honor and gender-based violence, including FGM or female genital mutilation. And our work merged as I saw that she also worked for the separation of mosque and state or religion and state. She's been published in multiple journals and has lectured in North America and Europe. And as you know, what we do is not exactly a risk-free thing, so we apologize for not putting her name on the agenda, but there are obvious reasons why we can't broadcast where she's going to be. So the way we're going to do this, trying to cover this whole thing in 50 minutes is going to be a challenge. But the plan is I'm going to sort of lay out for you what the strategy is, what we think the strategy should be for 15 minutes. Then I'm going to have a conversation with Raquel for 15 minutes about women's rights and how that plays into the entire equation on democracy and Islam. And then we'll spend 10, 15 minutes on questions, okay? So you can have a seat and I'll give you an overview for the next 15 minutes. So ultimately, the question that we're trying to address is, can Islam and democracy be reconciled, or are they reconcilable, or can they coexist? Obviously, as a Muslim who loves America and has been devout since I learned about my faith, I believe it can. I think if the question was fairly asked to a Muslim, does it coexist? I think we'd be dishonest if we said yes. There isn't one place in the world run by Muslim majorities that is a admirable democracy. So that is not a coincidence. But the bottom line is can it coexist? And when you're talking about a quarter of the world's population, obviously many of us in America, our families came here because we believed in an Islam that felt more at home in America, and we could practice our faith more freely here than we could in any of the so-called Muslim countries. But the question is how do we get that? And you know, there's our Islam, those of us who believe in liberty and the American experiment, and then there's their Islam. These are different versions of Islam, but obviously, again, there are those of us who are not in denial, not heaped in apologetics, that realize that there's some tough work of reform necessary to get us to the more spiritual Islam versus the more militant Islam. And I would tell you that we will be doing ourselves a major disservice if we think the Al-Qaedas and the ISISes of the world sort of come out of thin air, that they self-combust and somehow produce themselves from this benevolent theology. I mean, obviously, the theology that I believe in has been reconciled with modernity, but we have a major leadership problem in the Islamic world. The Al-Qaedas and the ISISes of the world come out of an ideology brewed in a cauldron that has been the majority of these countries that are part of the OIC, and I'd like to walk you through that. I always put this image of the Kaaba in the middle because there's a metaphor. At the end of my book, I have a letter to my children in which I tell them that Saudi Arabia sort of represents the dichotomy of the extremes of Islam. Inside this grand mosque, you see women and men praying next to each other, no materialism, doing the circumambulation around the Kaaba and a very spiritual journey, races mixed together, There's no supremacism of any kind during those 10 days as they worship in their pilgrimage. Outside the mosque is the most draconian, evil, supremacist theocracy on the planet. And they do that in the name of Islam. Women are abused and tortured and have no rights. Individuals like myself, Raif Badawi, you may have heard, is a dissident who runs an organization, or ran an organization called Free Saudi Liberals. We've been trying to educate America and the West about his plight. And instead of having our presidents go and fawn over kings upon their death, rather mention his name and use the bully pulpit of the White House to mention those names, and unfortunately they're not. Natan Sharansky had a beautiful op-ed a couple weeks ago in the Post in which he mentioned that what happened to the time in which Reagan used to mention prisoners of conscience as being our real allies, as Natan Sharansky was. And he said, until we change that paradigm and we start mentioning the Raif Badawis of the world, we will not be able to fix this dichotomy. So ultimately, the unique thing is when we formed our organization in 2003, my family and so many of the political dissidents of the Middle East that escaped over the last 2 generations since dictatorships have dominated the Middle East have done so in an environment in which no one even contemplated that there could be democratic reform. My grandfather was in and out of house arrest in Syria in the 60s. The Baathists were really the socialist, fascist, or Nazis of the Arab world. And ultimately, they created this environment in which political Islam, come radical Islam, was able to brew and grow. So ultimately, this has been the impediment, the obstacle. In order to reform, you have to have a laboratory in which free ideas are mixed and able to be discussed. There has not been that laboratory until 2011. Now, what happens is just like a pressure cooker that you open up, you're going to get sauce all over the ceilings, right? So when the dictatorships began to remove and we saw the Arab awakening, it wasn't a spring. You had basically societies that had become corrupt, that had become very pathological internally, begin to understand what to protest, but they didn't know what to replace that with. So they were the best protesters, but also the worst Democrats. And in Syria, the revolution started by secular moderates. It was Christians and Alawites and Sunnis who were in the streets. And then come 3-6 months of torture and shooting and bombs to the moderates, you started to create this environment of a nuclear political winter in which all that could survive were the cockroaches of humanity, which is radical Islam. And Assad and others let out al-Qaeda from the jails, and conveniently, and you don't have to believe me, look at the military patterns that have been described, what areas of Syria have been bombed. Conveniently, the moderate neighborhoods of the revolution were bombed. The ISIS areas were left alone. As General Keane and others have described it as sort of an entente, that it was left alone, which is back to the Arab Tyrant Manual 101, is leave militant Islam to flourish, cut its head off when it gets too strong, but use it as a tool to legitimize military authority, which then prevents the moderates from having a voice. Now that sounds conspiratorial. The bottom line, it's the reality. This is what has happened in Saudi Arabia, in Egypt with the Brotherhood. Political Islam has been fueled, and the analogy I love to use is that 60 years of Nasser, Sadat, Mubarak did more to fuel the Brotherhood, and 1 year of an open society did more to destroy the ideas of their 1 year of running that government than 60 years of dictatorship. So that should tell you what the mosques were used for under dictatorship, and many have said El-Sisi is sort of the, he gave this great speech about reform on January 1st, and he was hailed as sort of maybe the future of the Middle East. Well, he was talking to the right folks, the clerics of Al-Azhar University, which is sort of the Vatican of Sunni Islam, if there is such a thing. But he said that he told them the problem is with the violence and we need to reform. But the words he never used were liberty. He never talked about democracy, because a military dictator is not going to do that. Violence and extremist groups get in his way to maintain a benevolent, or whichever way you want to describe a dictatorship. But the real reform is going to actually be his own demise also, which is liberty and freedom. So I would tell you that there's an opportunity in the Middle East right now, which we may lose. Iran lost it in '79. Iran had a revolution against the Shah, and we saw now 30 years of Islamism. Now, you may say that, well, let's pick the best of two, the better of two evils. I will tell you that if Iran ever has a legitimate election, it will never go back to Islamism. So in some ways, to defeat, just as a cancer patient, if you want to defeat an ideology of theocracy, you have to let it be convincing to the people that it is a disaster. And the Iranian population, and I think as we saw with the Green Revolution that we abandoned and didn't help, would never, I don't believe, get elected if ever there was a legitimate election in Iran. And I think similarly with the Brotherhood in Egypt, the story you didn't hear about last month in the media was Ennahda, the Islamist party in Tunisia, lost an election. They won right after the king came up, but now they lost, and you have a secular party running Tunisia. Will it last? If we're not in this game and you let the Irans, Russias, Chinas, Qatars of the world fuel the ideas, and the secular party won't last long. So I think this is sort of the battle, and the Islamists want to wage this as Islam versus the West. And as you see with ISIS today, torturing and kidnapping hundreds of Assyrians, their beheading of the Copts in Libya, and the video which talked about them going to Rome. Their magazine called Dabik is what? It's a town in northern Syria that was used by the Ottomans in this eschatological narrative that town would be the town in which Islam reigns supreme over the world, and you push back the Crusaders. So they want this narrative of Islam versus Christianity. I think we need to accept it's a religious problem, but do the narrative that it's a battle within Islam against liberty. And I think ultimately the problem with most of the punditry, even this article in The Atlantic that's been discussed as sort of being great, it doesn't really put Islam in where it is in history right now. And we are where Christianity, I believe, was. And I know there's different problems with that analogy, but bottom line is what we need now is not a Martin Luther and reform. What we need first is the Thomas Paines and Thomas Jeffersons of Islam. Because once you defeat the theocrats, you can create and have that laboratory where reform and that compatibility with democracy can exist and begin to exist. We had that saying after 9/11, which was, why do they hate us? We've seen 7/7 in London, Fort Hood, Boston bombing, on and on. We've seen so many different attacks. I don't care how you want to define yourself on your foreign policy, non-interventionist versus forward intervention, whatever that policy, it is here. Muslims are a small part of our population, but the radicalization of Muslims, right now, this mantra that we're fighting violent extremism is just hogwash. That's a nonsense thing. Yes, violent extremism is at the ends of the spectrum, and I'm going to show you a little diagram that I hope puts it all into framework for you. But violent extremists are the tip of an iceberg that fuels them, and that pool that violent extremism comes in is the supremacism of the Islamic theocratic state. And until we take away that pool and drain it and take away the oxygen from that Islamo-patriotism that makes these New Yorkers want to get on a plane and go fight for the jihad, the only thing that'll be an antidote to that is not to continue this whack-a-mole against them wanting to be a violent extremist. It's for Muslims to re-engage patriotism to countries like America so that will inoculate them against that radicalization. If you leave here with one thing, understand what Islamism is. There are many different terms that we get thrown around in the media. Ultimately, I guess this doesn't shine on a monitor, but Islamism, jihadism, these groups, Islamic State, Al-Qaeda, Muslim Brotherhood, Boko Haram. By the way, Boko Haram in their language means Western education is a sin. That's not a coincidence. Wahhabism, Salafism, all of these are different permutations of a primary nuclear cancer, which is theocratic Islam or Islamism, a political movement. Hamas, as Harakat al-Islamiyya, is a Muslim movement for a political party that has a platform that the government, once that party comes to power, will have a platform of laws based in their interpretation of Sharia, and the identity of the state is Islamic. This is why if you want to defeat blasphemy laws, apostasy laws, gender segregation, and gender apartheid laws, all of that is fueled from giving clerics the right to adjudicate legal systems for the entire country. You take away the Islamic identity of the state, you take away jihad, apostasy, blasphemy, because all of those are linked to sedition against the state as long as you have an Islamic state. Leaving Islam is no longer sedition if you no longer have an Islamic state. So a lot of that follows, and I think is for Islam to become compatible with democracy, you have to defeat the Islamic State. So political Islam or the Islamic movement is the main problem. Every country has its own variants on this problem, and I don't want to oversimplify it in that, yes, as we approach Egypt, it's going to be different than Tunisia, it'll be different than the Saudi Peninsula, it'll be different than Qatar or UAE or Iran. Each of it has its own sectarian differences. But at the end of the day, as we look at a coherent strategy, be it domestically in our homeland security, or be it foreign policy and how to engage these countries, it should be just as when we were engaging the Soviets in the Cold War. We didn't have a different strategy for approaching Chinese communism and Cuban communism and Central American communism. We felt that it was all from the same tree, but just different permutations of the same pathology. Islamism has various permutations across these countries, but it's all variations of the same problem. So I would tell you, you heard from Susan Rice a few weeks ago that the new doctrine is going to be strategic patience. I have no idea what that is, other than what I would call a Darwin doctrine, which is letting the most evil, most money, petrodollar countries and most militarily strong win in this fight, where, as we know, without the city on the hill getting involved, without those advocates for freedom weighing in, not necessarily militarily, but at least in the war of ideas, as we had in the 20th century with the U.S. Information Agency, evil will reign. And ultimately, I think it's a battle between two narratives, a liberty narrative versus an Islamist narrative or the Islamic State. So in our organization, we've been talking for a decade now to the Bush administration and to the Obama administration about the need for a liberty doctrine. The Bush administration had what they called a freedom agenda. Unfortunately, the execution of that was thought to be simply you remove the head, Saddam Hussein, and you bring forth removal of the dictatorship, and somehow Jeffersonian democracy will evolve without engaging Islamism. Because President Bush also, just like Obama, did not want to engage political Islam. We saw Michael Gerson's piece in the Post a few weeks ago saying, well, no president can ever engage Islam because it will create this clash of religions. As a Muslim, I cannot tell you more how harmful that is. If you want to engage reformers, I'm going to give you a list of some of us, you have to call it, you have to, as Ezra Nomani said yesterday, one of our colleagues and journalists who was a friend of Daniel Pearl, she said, you name it to tame it. So you have to name it to engage Muslim reformers, or else we're irrelevant in the whole equation, and you let the mafia of Islamists run it. We're going to talk later about all the different aspects of women's rights. So ultimately, you've got the dictators who consider themselves secularists and have basically ended up demonizing what the values of secularism is, and then the Islamists. The amazing thing is that there's a marriage, as you see. Assad calls himself a secularist, but yet he's in bed with the biggest jihadist regime of the planet. So to say he's not a jihadist, I think, is a falsification. He's a Shia jihadist with the Iranian regime and against the Sunni jihadists of the Brotherhood and others, and ISIS. This is what I call the Islamic mafia of the planet. These are 56 Muslim-majority countries who have formed what they call the OIC, which is the neo-caliphate of today, and I would call this the Cold War of the 21st century is against this evil empire. So regardless of how different each country is, ultimately, their Islamic state, each of them, whichever permutation it may be, and the fact that they work together against the West, the fact that the OIC's lobby in Washington is focused on putting all of you, all of us on the defense, that we are Muslim bigots, we are anti-Islamic if we use the term Islamism, that somehow we have to have control. I mean, the State Department spent so much of your resources dealing with what they call 1618 to protect defamation of religions. Now, ultimately, it ended up pretty much being American principles, but the bottom line is that they call incitement to violence anything that their rulers feel insults Islam. So Raif Badawi is in jail for insulting Islam when in fact his organization is AIFD in Saudi Arabia, just about Saudi nationalism and the need to criticize clerics. So ultimately, Saudis we call them our allies, and yet they're feeding and fueling the beasts and creating the beasts that they claim are biting them in the rear end. And certainly they are, but the bottom line is that the Wahhabis of Saudi Arabia are not our allies. And this is a bipartisan, nonpartisan problem. We see many presidential libraries fueled by Saudi petrodollars and Gulf petrodollars. So this is a common American problem. And it's going to keep coming back. The terror threat will continue to increase. Our current strategy is no strategy. We keep hitting problems wherever they come from, whatever country. And also domestically, we find and arrest individuals, and it's like Groundhog Day. We keep doing the same thing every day, thinking that this is just another random, spontaneous combustion. And this slide sort of summarizes our goal is to take the ideas of the Establishment Clause, not anti-Islam, but rather a pro-Islamic approach to government that says that the problem is the establishment of religion in any of these countries. And then ultimately say that's where we are in this time in history, redefine the concept of ummah, which is the Muslim community. We accept the ummah as a Muslim community socially, but as state, in the Quran, ummah also means state. We need to put that into the dustbin of history. Just like Reagan talked about putting Soviet communism into the dustbin of history, we need presidents, media, universities that start talking about the Islamic State as being needing to go into the dustbin of history. This UDHR, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, all the OIC countries do not agree to that. They agreed to the Cairo Declaration, which basically puts into their agreement that there should be blasphemy laws, protection of Islam and other ideologies as having rights. And ultimately, in our work with youth and others on universities and elsewhere, we engage this conflict as in, if you talk to the Islamists, they'll say, well, the ISISes of the world get it wrong because they're misinterpreting hadith and other aspects. Okay, fine, that's a great discussion inside the mosque to have, which is the exegetical, theoretical discussion, no different than the Christian church had with canonic discussions, or the Jewish community has with Talmudic discussions of evolution of where Talmudic law should be in society. But the bottom line is that the reason society works is our governments are based in reason. You can bring your religious values to the government, but don't articulate it based on exegetical debate. And that is the whole crux of how you defeat ISIS and Islamic states, is by teaching them that societies based in reason and an establishment clause are preferable, that they be under God and not under Islam or under Christianity or under a specific flavor of that religion. So ultimately, what creates radicals is sort of an identity or an Islamo-patriotism. So the question is, the ISIS guys would rather die for the Islamic State, and Muslims like us would rather die for America. It's that simple. You can't counter just their tactic of violent extremism. You have to figure out what they would die for. So some of them may join the military. I mean, it's amazing to me that we, till this day, have no filter for Islamist ideology in our military, government, or other security clearances. And when I talk to congressional committees behind the scenes that we need to have hearings, they're like, oh my God, we can't do that. It'll appear like, a witch hunt for Muslims. Well, we're fighting a theopolitical ideology that's no different from communism and its threat, if not worse, because these guys control the keys to heaven for these Muslims. Now, we want to fight that, but we can't have a platform unless we engage political Islam. And ultimately, that's what radicalizes individuals like Nidal Hasan, whose resume seems very similar to mine, but yet is 180 degrees from where I was. And by the way, his mentor was also American-born. And, we kept talking about who radicalized Nidal Hasan. Well, his mentor went to school in Colorado and then was an imam in Northern Virginia. And the mosque in Northern Virginia basically said, oh my God, somehow he became violent in 2003 and was against the war, and then we kicked him out. Well, wait a minute. Where was the ideological continuum over that decade before that? There are many Muslim organizations in America that are clearly nonviolent, but their definition of democracy is by elections. And we realize, as beautiful as it was to see the purple finger in Iraq, that's not how we define democracy. Democracy is elections become, 3 wolves and a sheep voting on what's for dinner, right? That's the old quote. So, we can't change that and until we engage Muslims that democracy is really, we have a republic about the protection of minority rights and a Bill of Rights, which is key. We ran this ad, you can't read it, but basically a full-page ad in the New York Times a couple weeks ago, signed by 24 different Muslim organizations. And there are many more behind that. So when people say, one of our fellows at AIFD wrote this piece about how can we reclaim our beautiful religion, and basically we laid out in 3 paragraphs that we are against the Islamic State. And ultimately, when people say, where are the moderate Muslim voices, when the West ignores us because they say there's no problem within Islam, and the East or the Muslim countries are controlled by dictators they would disappear if we started to deal with these things, we're drowned out. And they put in jail, by the way, Muslims. This list would be Muslims in prisons in Saudi Arabia, Syria, or elsewhere. Last, I want to leave you with this diagram. If you have, let's say this is the entire population of Muslims. Now, I know this looks busy, but I want to walk you through it a second. Let's look at a continuum from secular Muslims all the way to theocratic Muslims. The elections in the Middle East so far have shown that the theocratic Muslims are maybe 30-40%, which is not a majority, but they can win elections if these guys divide themselves up into many parties, which happened in Egypt and Tunisia. So there's a continuum from secular to theocratic. Both sides have violent extremists that believe in doing that the ends justify the means, and you do it violently. In that middle are the non-violent majority of Muslims. The theocratic part, ultimately what we're trying to do is move them towards the middle, which is non-theocratic and believing in freedom and liberty, separation of mosque and state. And until we all get into this debate happening within this 90%, so yes, 1.5 billion people, these two ends, you remember there's secular terrorists too, that whether it be the PLO or others that don't believe in Islamic State but yet are militant by the way they do it, ultimately in the middle is pushing them away towards believing in a state based in liberty. And that, I think, if you understand this dynamic, it could do so much to put on steroids what our strategy should be. So ultimately, if we need what is our strategy? We need a national consensus that Islamism or any Islamic states are the central threat. We need to redefine who our allies and interests are, engaging Muslim reformers and take sides within the House of Liberty. And then we need to develop programs that advance liberty and counter Islamism. That's basically what I think we should do. Here are some resources, and I can give you these. We'll leave them up for you to look at. So what I'd like to do now is transition to our conversation with Raquel, because I think that ultimately, one of the most important things for us to realize is that when you're talking about women's rights, you have over half of the populations, and that could be a vehicle to energize reform. So,
if anyone wants to take a minute to come forward, there's plenty of room to sit. I don't know if that would be too distracting. You don't have to, obviously.
So I want to welcome Raquel to CPAC. She's an independent, and at AIFD we're nonpartisan. As you can tell, I believe this is a nonpartisan issue, since all stripes can benefit from the liberalization of Islam, if you will. Can you tell us a little bit about, what brought you and why you're a natural fit for CPAC and being here, even though you may be an independent?
Sure. The simple fact is that combating this kind of radicalism, combating Islamism, I can borrow this from you. All right. Come closer. I was always told growing up I was too much of a loudmouth, and look where I ended up. So I would say the obvious answer to why this issue needs to be discussed at CPAC and why I'm comfortable doing so is that political Islam or Islamism is something that we need to address in a nonpartisan way. When it comes to political Islam, when it comes to Islamism, women are public enemy number one. Women's bodies, what we do with them, how we behave, how we speak, how we interact with the public, and how we interact in private, those things serve as the borders and boundaries and markers of political progress or regression, of piety and politics. And so when you're looking at societies, Muslim-majority societies, where different modes of dress, where different kinds of behavior are legislated or mandated, you're looking at the way that society is defining its political, social, and religious agenda. And it's something that we should all be concerned about, not just as a matter of human rights, but because it's also something that is impacting women in our country as well.
And I think it's such a no-brainer that if we can form alliances with feminist movements and others to counter that, it would just be such a natural ability for us, with the most powerful country in the world, to defeat these movements that do so on the through the oppression of women. Can you sort of lay out for the audience how big this problem is? And I think the plight of women, just as significant as it doesn't get linked to the terror problem, as if it's two different problems. And I'd like you to lay out how this list that I mentioned before of Salafism, Islamism, Wahhabism, how the women's rights issues are so connected in their pervasiveness to the terror problem.
Sure. Groups like Salafis, like Wahhabis, like the Muslim Brotherhood, all use women, all see the control of women as a divine mandate. So when you are looking at what happens in situations where, for example, the Muslim Brotherhood has control, in Egypt, the rates of female genital mutilation are well over 90%, 93 to 94% in certain areas. That continued under the reign of Mubarak because of the influence of certain factors in that society. In the United States, some 500,000 girls and women are at risk of female genital mutilation alone, if only because we aren't looking at the problem and we're not comfortable identifying the problem. In Saudi Arabia, the mandating everything from mandating head covering to being required to have a male guardian when you exit the house, these are all ways in which these societies are demonstrating their so-called piety through women's bodies. By way of brief discussion of how bad it is, some 5,000 women and girls, and a very, very low estimate, are killed every year in honor killings. Now, while honor killings are not theologically, you couldn't say that they're an Islamic practice, they are a cultural practice that is very much adopted by some Muslim majority societies and communities. And when someone has been arrested for one of them, very often you will hear him say, or the family say, that this was done in the name of God. We have had cases in the United States. Noor al-Maliki was a young woman killed in Arizona, and the parents talked about how it was for their honor, and it was because of religion. When you want to see if there is a malignancy in a particular community, looking at how the women are treated is the first step to doing that.
And to that, I think, if we can talk about the theological components, is so much apologetics exists out there where you talk to Muslim leaders, imams, Islamic organizations that I showed you a smattering of there. They'll say, oh, in America, since we have freedom, women are equal to men, et cetera, and yet you find no women on mosque boards and in any of their significant leadership positions. So part of it, if you read, there are passages in our Quran in which women get a quarter of the inheritance, half of the vote of a man. How do we reform? Do you see that that's possible? What are some of the avenues for that?
He wants me to say the things that are going to get me fatwas. Ashley over there is like, I'm down for fatwa. There's a lot in the Quran that asks Muslims to dissent, to think critically. There's a verse in the Quran that says to bear witness and to speak for justice, even if it upsets those closest to you, your family, your community, your kin. And so to me, that's a call to really even take a more critical look at those parts of religious law or religious mandate that are problematic in 2015. And I have no problem saying that certain punishments or treatment of women are simply not suitable for modern day society, and that there are plenty of us who find no conflict between our personal faith and our existence in a secular democratic society. So it's really something that we need to stop empowering those quote unquote scholars who refuse to take a critical look and maybe read and propagate the thoughts of reformers instead.
Can you link the economic independence part, the microloan program, for example, that has been successful in women telling their husbands and brothers that they are interpreting the Quran wrong, that they were only able to do that when they became economically independent, which is why, again, as a conservative, free markets are so key to this entire change.
One thing that I've done a significant amount of work on in Pakistan is that there's a huge problem with acid-based violence. So, for example, if a young woman has refused a forced marriage, if a young woman has refused the advances of a man, if two fathers have a business dispute that they're looking to settle, very often the young woman will be attacked with acid in her face, completely deforming her, taking away her ability to work, and very often killing her in the process. It's incredibly gruesome, and it's horrible, and it's meant to take also away from the family. As misogynistic as this very construct is, what it does is take away from the family the value of giving that daughter in marriage, because she is no longer desirable, right? So what I came to learn, that when the Pakistani Taliban was doing this, that they were paying young men some $90 a day to join them and be trained by them, taking these young men out of schools, out of families where there was no other kind of economic empowerment. And I'm not saying jihadis just need jobs, but I'm saying, I'm saying that the jihadis do have jobs, and that's what that's the kind of thing that we're up against. So of course, when communities have greater financial empowerment, have the ability to engage in a free market system, they are able to do different things in their communities. Now, I would also say that every single country where there is a problem has to be looked at differently. Saudi Arabia has some of the highest per capita income in certain classes of their society, and some of the most misogynistic, problematic, radical problems as well. So it's not always that money is going to solve the problem. It really has to be twofold. The people who do hold the purse strings in Saudi Arabia and Pakistan need to be disempowered, but also there really needs to be what I call a revolution of the mind.
You're a self-proclaimed feminist. Can you tell us about what you see engaging the feminist movement in the global war on women that's real in the Islamic countries, and how do we do that?
I have for my entire life identified as a feminist. Growing up and dealing with certain things that I did, it made perfect sense to look toward those who spoke of liberating women. I unfortunately feel that modern-day feminism has failed the most vulnerable among us, and I don't think I'm alone in that assessment. So in this very country, when you have young women who are being taken away to have female genital mutilation occur, or it's happening worldwide, or there's an honor killing in Arizona, or there's an honor killing in Georgia, or there's an honor killing in Toronto, or there's an honor killing in Texas, and when I, as a Muslim feminist, want to talk about that problem, and I'm told that I'm being offensive to my own people by feminists, we have a problem. Okay, women who want to save the lives of other women and who want to empower other women, and men who want to empower women, need to understand that sometimes the conversations that we need to have are going to be uncomfortable. Someone might call you a bigot, someone might call you an Islamophobe, someone might call you a racist. They also tell me they want to kill me. So it would be immensely helpful if everyone in this room who cares about women's rights engaged in the conversation around what is happening, not just in Muslim-majority societies and communities, but in all communities where this is a problem. Forced marriage, for example, honor-based violence is a plague throughout South Asia, and that's not just Muslim communities, for sure. So, next question?
Yep. The last one is, I think you sort of started to get into there. What do you think is some of the strategies that we can take from here in engaging what we discussed as the liberty doctrine, especially when it comes to women's issues within and under Sharia law, et cetera? I know in Canada, for example, they were going to put in a Sharia court system. Muslim women actually stood up and said, please no, please no. Nobody listened to them until the feminists wrote an editorial in some of the Canadian newspapers, and all of a sudden they said, oh my gosh, this might be a bad idea. And these were the non-Muslim feminists. Initially, they weren't listening to the Muslim women. So how do we get past that in enabling globally, which could be, I think, the solution to radical Islam, is engaging women's movements?
That's kind of a tough question. Yeah. But I think it's a number of things, right? It's beginning to have the conversation in the face of individuals who don't want you having the conversation. It is challenging women's rights organizations to have the conversation. It is what we were talking about. Sorry, the Canadian example, right? So understand that within the Muslim community ourselves, we have there is tension already going on from people who are far to the left and people who are more toward the right. I find politically speaking, I'm much more of an independent. I support smart policy, whomever crafts it, right? So, in my own experience, I have found tremendous support from people who are just generally supporters of bodily autonomy and individual liberty, and aren't seeing this as a partisan issue. So approaching women's organizations and asking them to have discussions on these issues, to identifying reformers and hosting events. You can even host events in your city on these issues, discussions. You can screen. There's a film that I'm in actually called Honor Diaries. If you go to honordiaries.com, some of you already know it. That would be fantastic. But definitely finding and identifying those Muslim women in particular who are doing the hard work of Islamic reform, recognizing that there are people who see it as a divine mandate to shut us up, and we really do need the help of our non-Muslim allies in having these conversations, and we'll do everything that we can in order to advance rights for women, but absolutely need help and support.
So there's a list here that sort of summarizes what we've told you of what you can do. We'd like to end the last 10, 15 minutes with any questions that you may have, and we'd be happy to take those, so thank you. Okay, so her question is that the revolution will have to come from within Islam rather than from the West or something external. I could not disagree with you more, because within Islam right now is a laboratory that only breeds militant cockroaches. It's not breeding any type of like ISIS. It's not breeding any type of conversation that allows the academics and the pluralists to have a voice, because both sides don't want it. The monarchs and autocrats don't want the liberal voices, and the theocrats certainly don't want it. Now, in the streets of Egypt, you had millions of reformers, moderate Muslims. When people say there is no voice in moderate Islam, what were the 10 million Egyptians doing in the streets against the Brotherhood? Those were Muslim majority that did not want theocracy. Now, did they know how to implement that? I don't think so. They've been 50 years under dictatorship, and that breeds corruption and sectarianism and other things. So this is where, without adult supervision, not with military, but without adult supervision, where we get involved like we did in Eastern Europe, where our think tanks are helping them create civil society and Radio-Free Islam, other things like we did in the Cold War, to begin to engage critically and enable and empower, teach the Tunisians how to unite various secular parties into one or two parties instead of 50 parties that fractured them and allowed the Islamists to win. There's so many building blocks that we can help them with that isn't about Americanism per se, but about liberty, which is why I think we had it wrong. Our public diplomacy program was about Americanism and making sure we taught the Muslim world that we weren't offensive, that Muslims did well in America. That's not what we needed to do. We need to advance liberty and teach them about that.
Raquel, you're one of the beautiful women in Honor Diaries, and if anybody has not seen that film, it is absolutely imperative you see it. You're a courageous woman. Dr. Jasser, you are. My fellow Canadian, Raheel Raza, was in it.
Yep.
Dr. Jasser, I'm Canadian. I run that for America, for Canada. Salim and Raheel are good friends of mine, and you're there on the board of Muslims Facing Tomorrow. The thing that really I would like to see is when the moderate Muslims start to stand up, because I keep hearing that thing about the fear, how they might be, marginalized in their own communities, how they're really afraid to speak up. But Raquel is, you are, I am, many people who are here at CPAC, we stand up and speak out about how we want to save, democracy and what's important to us. And so I don't know how we can get a movement going. I mean, when you opened your thing in New York, you had 39 people there. I mean, I flew to Toronto. There were 79 people there. There's millions of Muslims in America and Canada. Where are they? That's my question.
I hear you. That's why we're doing this work. But I will tell you that your analogies, you also, in your ideas, didn't come out of thin air. there was a centuries of progress, a very bloody war against theocracy in Europe, and hundreds of thousands, millions died fighting against theocracy, and ultimately creating this sense that my grandfather used to say, Americans breathe democracy like oxygen, they don't realize what they have. So it takes quite a while to educate Muslims that secularism isn't this military dictatorship, it's about liberty. So that's something that you all feel is sort of natural to be out there protesting. It took the Egyptians a lot to do that, but then they were like, well, what do we do now? You know, they didn't understand separation of powers and all. They haven't been taught that in their schools. So my father can tell you what's taught in the Syrian schools. It's not about how to create government. It's about America's evil, the Zionist conspiracies. So they don't have the building blocks there yet to be responsive, reflexive as you are. Yes.
So what sort of troubles me even more is that some of the craziness is now coming in North America from the second and third generations, children who should have become completely Americanized and Canadianized by now. So in Canada, we have a whole bunch of these kids getting onto planes and then leaving for Syria. And their families are saying that the Canadian government didn't do enough to keep them here. How do we reply to that?
Because there's some women who are doing that.
You know, I turned 30 not too long ago. And, you know, come out of a generation where I'm seeing people my own age do just that, right, and a bit younger. And we work on this with the Muslim Liberty Project as well, which targets youth aged 15 to 30. Some of them are here today. To really engage them with the single message that your personal faith does not need to, can work in synergy with, does not have to be in conflict with your American identity. And I think one of the things that we have not done successfully as Muslims and as Americans is help people have a sense of national pride, have a sense of identifying with being American. I think a lot of the young people who get drawn toward radicalization, and I've seen this in one young man in particular who has, I'll just be personal, from Edmonton, Canada, has hassled me online in incredibly vulgar ways since 2008. This is a young man who began this at the age of around 26. I was able to find out a bunch about his family and everything. His family's very successful. He's kind of the loser, okay? He has turned to a particularly politicized interpretation of his religion because it gives him something to be. Okay, it gives him a routine. It tells him exactly what he can eat, exactly how to pray, how to dress, in every single minute detail, right? And it gives him an enemy, you know, so he is drawn to that like someone is drawn to a gang. Okay, so there are a lot of young people who are looking for some sense of identity in a national identity as well as something that is, quote, sacred and good, right? So political Islam has that. It stands in as an identity, as in a structure, when we're not giving them pulling them into an identity that makes sense, that can make that personal faith and that national identity cohesive.
And I think the solution being Muslims, and this is why it's so important, especially for conservatives, those of us who love our faith and believe in certain orthodoxy, I think are going to be much more effective at this reform than those Muslims that might dismiss a lot of the rules and a lot of the parts of our faith because it's such a key. Yes, sir.
Doctor, the Obama administration's insistence that we rhetorically separate Islam from Islamic jihad, useful or dangerous?
I think I mentioned that is how dangerous that is because you marginalize every reformer that wants to have a debate against the imams. People say, well, Zuhdi, you're a lay Muslim. You're not useful. We need an imam to do this and fix it. As I mentioned to you, America is the laboratory of religious freedom because the lay intellectual Christian community revolted against the clerics and the theocrats. Not at any deprecation to Christianity, but a deprecation to theocracy. And I think similarly, the solution is not going to come from those who hold the reins of the money and the power in Islam, which is almost every imam, I'm sorry to say, you know, or those imams that agree with us, and I've listed them in my book and elsewhere. They just don't have the abilities right now to be part of this, but the lay community will be the solution, and you have to engage.
Yeah.
Hi, first, thanks for sharing with us. My name's Sean, and at risk of sounding cliche, I think this conversation is really important now. My question is about the media's role in promoting the liberty doctrine.
Number one is, please, this sort of hyper attention to Islam after every catastrophe, and then a week later we're off the map, has to stop. We need constant programming. You know, I call it, we need a program on fault lines. The fault lines between the Islamic world and liberty. Constantly, where we address women's issues, address, you know, Sharia, address equality, economics. All these things are major issues where you have an Arab awakening with huge opportunities. So have programming, university programs, not at universities that are bought and paid for by the Saudis, like programs at Harvard or Georgetown or elsewhere, but actually where you have intellectuals that are pushing against political Islam and engaging reformers. We have many that are looking for platforms, so there needs to be a steady impact for doing that.
And certainly if you have connections in media and you're seeing individuals not being represented, please use those connections. I mean, I turn on the television sometimes and I'm like, that person is being interviewed on a question of national security? Wow, that's frightening, you know. So I would definitely advocate, you know, use Twitter, use social media, use your own personal connections, and try to demand as an American that you want something different. You have to pick on Ashley.
Thank you. The title of this presentation is "Can Islam and Democracy Coexist?" But unfortunately, we saw Palestinians elect Hamas and Egypt elect Muslim Brotherhood. So do you think it would be more productive to say, instead of pushing democracy in the Islamic world, would it be better to push a constitutional republic where you have individual rights versus a democracy where, as they're playing it now, somebody can vote your rights away?
Absolutely. That's why our doctrine that we want our foreign policy to be is a liberty doctrine, not a democracy doctrine. Our forum's called the Forum for Democracy because it's about debating, you know, building a forum for that. But the answer is liberty. It's not democracy. So that's the key, is teaching those values and advancing that. Unfortunately, our current president is a post-American president who doesn't believe that we have a role in the world for advancing those. The book he carries around is Fareed Zakaria's book on the post-American presidency. I'm not making that up. So, you know, the bottom line is that I believe our ideas, because left to its own devices, I don't see any other country being able to advance liberty other than the United States or Europe, Canada, and Western countries. Back there, yes.
With a very loud left in America, I feel like that Christian beliefs are targeted a lot, especially things that we may share as Christians and with Muslims, like homosexuality can be talked about. The left is very quick to target Christians, but not as much feminists to support Muslim women or Muslims of faith where gays are exploited. Do you see that?
You know, I think a big part of our narrative is, you know, I turned out the way I did because, you know, I grew up in a small town in Wisconsin, and to see Christians wanting to celebrate Christmas and believing in their faith publicly made me feel that I could celebrate Ramadan and believe in my faith publicly. The laïcité policies of countries like France and the hyper-secularism that pushes religion underground is why Europe has a bigger problem with radical Islam than we do. That doesn't mean we don't have a problem, but it's on a lesser slope than Europe because of that very issue. America is a much more publicly religious place, so Islamists have a harder time telling Muslims that you can't be yourself in America. Versus in Europe, they're able to pull the jihadists into them because they say, oh, look, they hate all religion. This is a godless society, so therefore you have to join us. So I will tell you the other thing is the Muslim issue is a major tool in both parties, and we have to take that out. It's used as a ping pong ball between, you know, one side that thinks there's no Muslims that are terrorists, it's just a victimization problem, and another side that feels that every Muslim's a potential terrorist or might be lying. Both are wrong. In the middle is 98% of America that wants to see good and protect our country and advance liberty, but there's been no discussion to try to unify our country. I think, what time is it? Are we over? Yep. One last question, burning questions? Yes, sir.
My name is Fred Fleiss. I'm with the Center for Security Policy. I'm a big supporter of yours,
Yes.
as my center is. My concern is that you're being drowned out by Muslim organizations in this country, like the Council of American Islamic Relations, that have ties to the mosques and the Muslim
Go ahead, Al.
Well, yeah, you can follow up on that, sure. I mean, that's the question we ask every single week on our staff conference call, quite literally. You know, we pitch to media every single week. We have constantly pushed to try to find new allies. You know, simply put, and just put in the most crass terms, other organizations have millions in questionable dollars that we don't have. You know, we are a staff of only 2 people who receive any kind of paycheck. Zuhdi's not one of them. So it's something that we do because we believe we have to do it. So we absolutely need, again, the support of non-Muslim allies to be approaching media, to be connecting us with people, telling us who we should speak to, and being sincere in that. You know, if there's someone you think we need to speak to, we will speak to them. But we will continue to push for more significant exposure, for sure.
And, you know, I think the end, right now the narrative is that, oh, what does the Muslim community think? It's like we're some monolithic group. And for a media that thrives on diversity, it's almost like they put on their cap on who should we call for the Muslim opinion, and they call in that monolithic autocratic group that is byproducts of the OIC. I mean, if you look, CARE's reports are basically republished on the Organization of Islamic Cooperation website. So they are groups that are looked at sympathetically by these tyrants. Now, on the other hand, CARE was just named a terror group by the UAE, which I disagree with, by the way, because if you want to defeat these groups, pushing them underground makes them martyrs and makes them victims. And that's how the Brotherhood cut its teeth in Egypt, was being called a terror group. Yes, they have advocated terror in Egypt. They do swim in and out of that pool, quite a few. But I will tell you that we will be much more effective in defeating groups like CARE and MPAC and the Islamic Side of North America by letting them soak in the sunlight of their own extremism when we expose them as tools of political Islam and show that they're collectivists rather than true advocates for reform, because all of their mantra, you'll find, is a monolithic mantra of, oh, apologetics, Islam is religion of peace, etc., marginalizes us, allows them to continue to hold the key to what is and what is not Islam and Muslims. So where you can demand to have diverse voices, we have lists of them that I showed you in that ad and elsewhere. We just need to have the opportunities and platforms to do that. We demanded CARE to have a debate. We had a venue and everything at Georgetown. They responded to me with comparing our group to the KKK. That was their response. We will not debate the KKK. And I'm on a list of the top 20 Islamophobes, along with proudly with your organization, Fred. And you know, this is absurd. Now, is there some vitriol that is bigotry against Muslims out there? Yes, there is. But calling it Islamophobia is actually, Islam's an idea. It's not a human being that you could be a bigot. It prevents debate and prevents the reform that we need. And this kind of venue, I want to thank CPAC for giving us a venue that allows all of you to hear our voices, and God bless you all. Thank you.